Hello, this is Susan Nash, and I thought it might be interesting to take a look at an experiment on a bird in an air pump, oil on canvas, by Joseph Wright in 1768. This painting, I believe, is in the Tate. Okay, so essentially, Joseph Wright, who lived in Derby, England, in the 18th century, liked to paint on topics that had to do with natural philosophy and essentially the theories and ideas of the French philosophers and the Enlightenment that was going on the 18th century in England. It had been kicked off earlier that century by the writings of writers like Rousseau and Diderot, and in England, a lot of the Enlightenment writers included Edmund Burke, who was on the philosophical side of things, and your basic thinkers like Adam Smith and in economics, who also wrote about Bellet, and just the usual suspects at any rate. So this was a time of great experimentation. It was the run-up to the first Industrial Revolution, and a lot of destabilizing ideas about the role of human endeavor and human scientific experiments and knowledge versus that which was like given by divine afflatus, divine revelation, either through church or through kings, queens. It was destabilizing in that sense as well, in the idea that that monarchies could while it was supported monarchies, that only monarchies where the king, for example, the George I, George II, embraced science and created like the Royal Academy, similar to what happened at the end of the 17th century in the late 1600s with Newton and Charles II, and those great strides forward, which were looked at as essential to having development in economics, trade, as well as implements of war. So they were seen as ways to have great advantage. So they were generally supported. But that said, that there was a massive translation of what it meant to be a human in the world and what it meant to work with nature and the role of nature and what we know about nature. So here are some of the paintings. Here's a philosopher giving a lecture on the orrery, in which a lamp is put in the place of the sun. So just an orrery is something that shows the motions of the planets in relation to each other. It's used in astronomy. And here are three persons viewing the Gladiator by candlelight, so essentially a replica of a famous classical sculpture that is essentially a study of human anatomy. And then here's the experiment on a bird in the air pump. And let's just take a look at what's going on here. Check out the bird. The air pump is something that creates a vacuum, and here's a mechanism that sucks the air out. And in previous experiments, the bird would just instantly collapse, and then depending on whether or not they open it up quickly enough, the bird would just pop back to life. So here we have the scientist who literally holds the life of the bird in his hand, and potentially rebirth, or essentially recovery. But let's just take a look at how we should approach this painting. and so that we analyze for ourselves and think for ourselves. So let's take the first step. Let's take a look at the size of the painting. 72 inches by 94.5 inches. This is a large size, and it's usually reserved for history painting, and that, as we remember in the hierarchy of paintings, is the most important. There's history painting, then there's landscape, genre, and still life. Still life being considered the least important. So what does history painting do? It has a serious subject, and it captures an important moment in history, usually something like creation of the earth, resurrection, crucifixion and resurrection, also history in terms of heroic themes. Poussin's Rape of the Sabine Women is one example. Let's take a look at the subject. The subject here is scientific investigation, and it's like a little bit destabilizing. It's not religion, it's not myth, not political history. It reminds me of one of the group portraits of Rembrandt or others. It's a group of diverse people. You might even see these like in genre paintings, as, for example, like Vermeer. But what's going on? The subject captures the moment between life and death, so essentially it's most akin to history painting, and then, of course, the size, too. So, again, this is being suggested that this is the most important kind of painting and addresses the most important topic. So let's look at the composition. Again, scientist is in the middle with his hand in the air. He's clearly the most important person in the painting. He literally holds life and death in his hand. The white bird is rare. It's, I think, a cockatoo. So it's suggesting a lot of the investigations in natural history and botany and zoology that were occurring through a lot of the voyages and importing intriguing new things back to the empire, the seat of the empire, England. Now let's look at the bird. It resembles a white dove, and that, as we know, is a symbol of resurrection, or can be. And look at the expressions of the females. They evoke classical paintings of the crucifix, the crucifixion of Christ. So here we have the one who's holding her. Okay, so probably on the left, the woman on the left, the older woman, could be equivalent to Elizabeth, the older sister of Mary. And then the Virgin Mary, the mother of Christ, could be suggested by the woman who's holding her hand on her face. And then the little girl who has a rather low-cut little gown could evoke Mary Magdalene, a very popular figure in crucifixion paintings, who looks on curiously with faith. Notice she has faith. Men could evoke the disciples, and the lighting itself suggests illumination, enlightenment, and brings to mind the enlightenment and intellectual inquiry of the French philosophers. Now let's think about the sublime. Edmund Burke in 1757 wrote a highly influential work on aesthetics, a philosophical inquiry into the origin of our ideas of the sublime and beautiful. And he suggested that sublime art is art that refers to greatness beyond all possibility of calculation, measurement, or imitation. An example of that would be John Martin's The Great Day of His Wrath. Now, let's think about this again. What is the sublime? If the goal of art, or great art, is to incorporate the sublime and generate passion, the sublime is something that triggers an emotion. So it triggers a passion, and that passion is astonishment. And then he defines astonishment as that state of the soul in which all its motions are suspended with some degree of horror. In this case, the mind is so entirely filled with its subject that it cannot entertain any other. So let's take a look again at this, I consider, highly sublime painting. And, the lighting, everything, the composition puts together all that to evoke, most definitely, the sublime. You have horror, awe, fascination, can't be imitated. So let's take a look at some of the other implications when we really look at this painting closely. The size demands that one consider this topic, scientific investigation, to be as important as religious and mythological and historical topics. The lighting draws one's eyes to the white bird to be killed and who will potentially pop back to life, kind of a secular resurrection, and the consequent sublime moment is a combination of awe and horror, often seen in the divine, or at least paintings that represent divine. The scientist with his hand that controls life and death is equated to God. Now let's take a look at the window view of the full moon, and it juxtaposes the natural world with that of the unnatural, and it provokes questions about what happens when natural processes are tinkered with. Ethical questions, questions about who and what a human is. What are the limits? What should man do? This, interestingly enough, obviously inspired Mary Shelley and the Romantics. The painting captures a moment that imparts knowledge about natural philosophy that has been gained by means of scientific observation rather than divine revelation, destabilizing to both orthodox religions, and it's also empowering to new knowledge builders. This is potentially very subversive. So even though one could say this is painted in the neoclassical style, it's clearly kind of an Enlightenment painting, I would argue that it captures what the Romantics would embrace just 40, 50 years later, and it obviously very much captures what Edmund Burke was describing, who became kind of the go-to philosopher to support what the Romantics would be doing later. So just a few thoughts, and I hope you've enjoyed this, and let me know your thoughts, and please share.